Hello, young scholars. Welcome to what will hopefully be one of our more succinct podcasts. Today, we are going to be talking about the Dutch Republic and particularly its golden age in the 1600s. And this is also Whiny Cat edition because I'm sure at some point in this podcast you're going to hear the cat in the background complaining about how his life is ruined because he hasn't been fed. Now, to start. Let's do a little background on our Dutch here. So before we get too far ahead of ourselves, this is the Spanish Netherlands. It says Europe in about 1600, but really we want to be thinking back to our 1500s. This is the time of Charles V and Philip II, right? Our Habsburgs. Charles V, of course, not only King of Spain as Carlos I, also Holy Roman Emperor. And he had actually inherited these lands through his father, through their connection to the House of Burgundy, which had a prominent role in the 100 Years' War. Now, um, there's going to be a revolt that is going to start in the Netherlands in the middle of the 16th century, in 1568 to be exact. And this is going to be caused by a couple of things. First of all, under Philip II, there's going to be heavy taxation of the Dutch, these people from the Netherlands, on the part of the Spanish crown. You will recall that when the Habsburg territories were sort of divided up upon the abdication of Charles, that his son Philip received Spain, the territories in Italy, the stuff in the New World, and then also the Netherlands up here, right? So this is part of Philip's territory. So number one, there's heavy taxation. Philip is attempting to pay for his interventions in the religious wars in France. He is attempting to pay off debts that his father accumulated during the Habsburg-Valois conflicts in Italy. He is fighting the Turkish navy. Remember the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. He's also trying to pay for the administration that is governing all of these territories in the New World and so forth and so on, right? So Philip is having to spend a great deal of money, and he's trying to use the Netherlands to get it. You will remember, of course, that the Netherlands, this area that includes Flanders, during this period was really sort of there he is, sort of the Italy of Northern Europe as far as being a locus for trade. Remember, particularly the wool trade going on between England and the Netherlands. They're also, tied into a lot of other maritime trade routes here, right? So they're a very wealthy area. Lots of trade, lots of banking, large middle class, therefore a valuable source of tax revenue. Also, inefficient Habsburg government. This is not so much a problem under Charles because Charles had grown up in the Netherlands, and so he really saw the Netherlands as one of the centerpieces of his empire. However, Philip is running his empire from Spain, from Spain, pardon me, from the Escorial Palace in Madrid, and so he is sending Spanish administrators into the Netherlands to fulfill his policies. And this alienated the Dutch in a lot of ways. First of all, they objected to their traditional institutions being pushed aside in favor of this monarchy, which you remember during this period is expanding its power, attempting to centralize. And so, a lot of those the town councils, the local nobility objected to sort of being pushed aside. But more to the point, it took a message approximately 4 weeks to get from the Netherlands to Spain, right. So it takes quite a while, and that's an awfully long time when you're trying to make decisions and you're having to wait on the king to write you back and so forth and so on, right. So not only do they not like these Spanish administrators, these foreign administrators coming in, telling them what to do, operating at the behest of the king, and not giving credence to sort of the local power structure. They also object to the fact that it's taking a million years for them to actually get their marching orders, right? And that's causing a lot of problems. Great example of this is going to be the Council of Blood. During this period, we also have some religious controversy, which we're going to get to in just a moment. And so the Spanish king is going to send the Duke of Alba marching into Spain from Italy with an army of about 10,000 men, using the Spanish road that is developed, this sort of Habsburg road that runs up through through the Habsburg territories in Europe. He's going to send in an army of about 10,000 Spanish and Italian mercenaries, and the Duke of Alba is going to use those people to suppress Protestantism, to try people, and subsequently execute several thousand Dutch citizens. Right. So obviously that's not popular. So what we're going to have is a lot of our cities and sort of provinces up here in the north are going to actually revolt against Spanish rule, right? So initially our Spanish Netherlands would have included sort of all of these territories here, but the north are going to start attempting to break free. And you can see here this is actually a map that starts in 1576. The revolt technically starts about 8 years earlier than that. But as sort of time goes on, the tide of the war sort of ebbs and flows. But we end up with this separation where the southern part remains Catholic, remains held by Spain. The northern part is going to become more Protestant and sort of be controlled by the Dutch. Okay, so and eventually we're going to get these united provinces. Well, what do we need to know about this war itself? It is sometimes going to be referred to as the 80 Years' War because it's going to start in 1568, and it's not truly going to resolve itself until 1648 as a part of the Treaty of Westphalia, which hopefully we have already talked about, but if we haven't, we will shortly, I'm sure. And it is started by this group of Dutchmen, these various nobles, merchants, and in some cases common people, under the leadership of William, the Prince of Orange. Okay, the Prince of Orange is sort of the highest ranking, if you will, nobleman in the Netherlands. He's relatively powerful. He has a lot of pull with the people, as it were, and so as a result, he's going to become sort of the centerpiece around which the rebellion will operate. Our first Prince of Orange here is William the Silent. William the Silent, Prince of Orange. We're actually going to have several Williams of Orange. In fact, one of them is going to subsequently become William III, King of England, due to his marriage to Mary Stuart. And we'll come across that later. Incidentally, by the way, Orange, the connection to the House of Orange. The House of Orange is going to descend down into the modern Dutch monarchy. That is also the reason that orange is the official sort of color of the Netherlands. Like, for example, if you watch the World Cup, their teams are always going to be clad in this orange. That is a reference to the House of Orange leading them in the revolt against the Spanish. The other thing we need to know about this 80 Years' War, this War of Independence that is promulgated by the Dutch in the late 16th and early 17th century, is that it, like all of our sort of political and religious conflicts in this period, such as the wars of religion in France and certainly the 30 Years' War, is going to represent an internationalization of conflict. So obviously this is being fought by the Dutch against the Spanish. The Spanish are leveraging their resources in Italy to help them fight the war in some cases. And the Dutch are going to be receiving monetary assistance and occasionally even weapons and troops from other Protestant powers such as the English and some of the German states, who have a vested interest in seeing the Spanish fail and the Protestant cause succeed. And then, of course, sometimes they're also going to be receiving support from the French. Remember, the French, even though they are Catholic, they hate the Habsburgs. Anything that is bad for the Habsburgs is good for the Valois and later the Bourbon monarchs. And so, they're also going to continue to sort of support this Dutch rebellion despite the religious issues at play there. Now, we must ask ourselves, how is it that this tiny, tiny little set of provinces here is able to contend with an empire that includes Spain and Italy and large parts of the New World? And what we really need to get at there is a couple of things. First of all, there is a religious divide here, right? The Dutch are Protestant for the most part. Many of them, in fact, are Calvinist, which, as we've seen in France, our Calvinists and our Catholics don't especially get along. So there's certainly a little bit of extra drive to succeed there. In fact, there's this event that takes place in the 1560s that drives the arrival of the Duke of Alba, called Beeldenstorm, which literally means like the icon breaking storm, right? These sort of iconoclast storm. This is a period during which a bunch of our Calvinists decided they're going to go tearing through parts of the Netherlands, attacking Catholic churches, and so forth and so on, right? Now, the other reason that the Dutch are able to actually hang with the Spanish is that, again, this is a very rich area. And so like we saw in Renaissance Italy, when you have a relatively small state that commands a great deal of trade and money, that is going to make it easier for them to get loans, to hire troops, to build ships, and so forth and so on. We also saw the same thing with the kingdom of Chola in southern India, for those of you who remember us talking about Chola in the post-classical period. And the other thing we have to keep in mind is that Spain's attention is split a heck of a lot of different ways. Remember, as we already pointed out, they're fighting the Ottomans, they're fighting in Italy in some cases, they're fighting the French, and so forth and so on, right? So the victory of the Dutch during this 80 Years' War that culminates with a treaty that's called the Treaty of Munster, that is actually sort of like a sub-piece, if you will, of the Treaty of Westphalia, is going to be important for a couple of reasons. First of all, the victory there is going to lead the Dutch, or actually, I guess the war itself, is going to lead the Dutch to develop their navy and their merchant marine. So they're going to become the big sea power, the big naval power of the 17th century, competing, of course, with the English. It's going to lead to this sort of golden age of the Dutch Republic. This crucible that's being created by this war is going to drive them to sort of become great, right? It's either sort of be great or destroyed. And on the flip side, it's also going to accelerate the demise of Spain as a great power, right? Spain not only loses a lot of resources fighting against the Dutch and their allies, they're also going to lose a lot of credibility. This huge empire wasn't able to deal with this tiny revolt in this little tiny piece of its territory, okay? So make sure that we keep that in mind when we're thinking about the Dutch, right? This war sort of drives the Dutch to greatness. It drives the Spanish into decline. It's a victory of sort of money and trade income over large empires and inefficient government. It represents internationalization of conflict. In many ways, it's part of these religious wars that we've been talking about, where we have our Protestants going toe-to-toe with our sort of traditional Catholic powers. Now, let's talk for a moment about the Dutch state. So the Dutch are governed in this period by what's called the States General, and this should remind us in some ways of the Estates General that we see in France. The States General is made up of representatives from all of the 7 provinces that are part of this United Provinces, this Dutch Republic. So in some ways they are similar to Venice, right? The primary power broker here is going to be this legislative body that is theoretically based upon sort of democratic institutions and elections, but it's similar to Venice in that, you know, the States General is really sort of an oligarchy of powerful noble and merchant families that are sort of managing the state for, in some cases, their and in some cases everybody else's benefit, right? So we have these meetings of these sort of austere Protestants. This is actually a Rembrandt painting. We'll talk about him in a few moments. So that said, however, we do have a provincial court system that is going to be involved in sort of guaranteeing certain rights for members of the community. Also, the Princes of Orange, one of them is pictured here. This is our boy William the Silent. The Princes of Orange are going to function as the sort of executive, kind of like a quasi-president, quasi-monarch, and their position is called the Stadtholder, and this is spelled Stadtholder, Stadtholder. And Stadtholder is a term that literally means a placeholder, right? Somebody who manages or controls a place. It's actually directly related in French to the word lieutenant, which literally, again, meant a holder of a place. Lieu meaning place, and tenant being, you know, a person who sort of controls this place, right? So the Stadtholder, the executive, the person who controls the place, who manages the place, right? And so he has this function as the executive. Now, practically, he has very, very little power. Really, his main job is to sort of control the army and the navy, and to lead the republic in sort of times of war and that sort of thing. And so his really the power that he has is he can sort of appoint people to these army and navy posts. So he does have a certain amount of patronage that he can leverage there. Okay. This, by the way, is the house in Amsterdam in which the States General would meet. It's a lovely, lovely sort of austere Protestant building. So let's talk about the Dutch economy. Now, again, to make another reference to Renaissance Italy, the Dutch economy, like the Italians of the Renaissance, based on commerce and banking. Okay, so number one, we have the legacy of that Flemish wool trade, right? There's a lot of sort of wool trading between England and Flanders, and then cloth production that's going on during the Middle Ages that is driving the foundation of this economy. And so as a result of that, some of these major ports in various parts of Flanders and the Netherlands, like in Amsterdam and Antwerp, The Hague, Rotterdam, so forth and so on, these major cities are going to be really, really crucial to trade, not only within Europe, but also beyond. In the 1630s, Dutch shipping accounted for about half of the shipping that was going on in Europe, and keep in mind that's at a time where they're still at war. The Dutch, because of their position on the North Sea, also come to sort of control and dominate all of the Baltic trade, so all that grain and timber and fur and amber that's coming out of Russia and what is today, Latvia and Sweden and Finland and all that kind of stuff, all being passed around on Dutch ships. And of course, the Dutch are fighting with the Spanish on the seas for control of these overseas trade routes into the Americas. You'll notice, if you look at the map, we have some Dutch colonization in the northern part of North America, particularly a colony called New Amsterdam, which the English are going to later on capture and subsequently rename New York. You'll also notice that the Dutch get their hands on some Caribbean islands and a little bit of territory in South America as well, which they are going to use to produce sugar, which in the 1600s is one of the big money makers. They're also going to form a number of trading posts on the coast of Africa. They're going to form a colony down here in South Africa. These people, by the way, are going to be called Boers, B-O-E-R-S. We'll have some trouble with them later on. And then, of course, they also have a number of small trade ports and territories that they control in India, in modern-day sort of Indonesia, and even up towards China. Right? I'm particularly fascinated with some of these because obviously they're going to be some of the only Westerners that are allowed to have contact with the Japanese during the Tokugawa period. Right? So the Dutch really have, even though they're a very, very small country, they have their fingers in a lot of different pots, sort of international trade-wise, and we will definitely want to bear that in mind. Now, the Dutch are also big shipbuilders. Obviously, if we're going to be doing all this ocean-going trade, we need to have a lot of ships. And then, of course, we have a number of major banking houses because, again, during this period, unlike, say, a France or a Spain, where you have a really, really powerful monarchy that can sponsor the colonization and the voyages to the New World and all that sort of stuff, we don't have that in the Netherlands. What we do have, though, is a lot of powerful merchant families. And so during this period, they're going to develop this thing called a joint stock company. And they're going to basically be companies where a whole bunch of people are going to chip in money, and they will therefore own a percentage of the company, much in the way people buy and sell stocks today. And then it's a way for a large group of people to pool a large sum of money for these major overseas ventures without one person having to take on an extraordinary amount of risk. And so because of the need for this credit and these transactions, the stocks and all that sort of stuff, Amsterdam in particular is going to become a major banking house. And in about the year 1600, Amsterdam is by far and away the most important trade and financial center in Northern Europe. There's no question. The other thing that we have going on here is population growth, big population growth between 1550 and 1650 especially, and 50% of that population lives in towns. as a result of that, one of the things you need to keep in mind is that the Netherlands and also Belgium are often referred to as the low countries because they are literally at a very low altitude. They're real marshy, they're real swampy. A lot of it gets flooded by the sea from time to time. And so there's going to be a lot of environmental modification that's going to go on. They're going to be building canals in some of these cities to sort of connect various parts of the city together. They're going to be building these large dikes to hold back the water, the seawater that can potentially flood in. And then behind those dikes, they're going to suck out a lot of the marshland and turn the sort of reclaimed land into something that they can farm on, right? So all of this commerce is also being supported by a lot of environmental modification that is going on. And really, again, given their size, it's going on a pretty massive scale. We really haven't seen something quite that big in most of the rest of Europe. The last thing I'll mention is the Dutch East India Company, which is always abbreviated VOC because, again, we're operating in Dutch here. We're not operating in English, right? And the Dutch East India Company is going to be responsible for a lot of what you see in the orange and the light green, right? A lot of that stuff is going to be trade posts and colonies that the Dutch East India Company is chartered and financed in order to produce. It's their job as much as possible to really sort of dominate trade, not only to sort of push the Spanish out, but also to maintain that favorable economic position for the Dutch. So this Dutch East India Company, or VOC, they're going to establish colonies in Ceylon, in southern India. They're going to be in Indonesia. They're also going to be in the Caribbean, as I said, producing sugar and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so this is really, really big. And so as a result of this, we're going to see a very rich, very robust, very dynamic society, as you see here in this painting, which is by an artist named Van der Elst, the celebration of the Treaty of Munster, 1648, which again is the sort of celebration of Dutch independence. And you'll notice a lot of these guys are wearing either orange feathers in their hats or sort of orange sashes to indicate their support for this new Dutch state. So again, like Renaissance Italy, where there is money, we also tend to have a vibrant culture and social life. So first of all, we need to keep in mind that the Netherlands is, hold on. Excuse me. Excuse me again. The Netherlands is what one historian called a haven of toleration in the 1600s. Again, the Dutch are a people who are used to being sort of religiously preyed upon by these Spanish overlords, and so they're actually pretty willing to sort of accept other peoples of different faiths. There are, for example, a lot of Huguenots who flee France in the 15 and 1600s as a result of the wars of religion there, or as a result of further persecution by the Bourbon monarchs after Henry IV. So a lot of them are going to flee into the Netherlands, where they're going to find a very supportive Dutch state that is going to take them in. A lot of them are also going to head into Prussia, by the way. There's also a relatively robust Jewish population in the Netherlands, and again, they tend to be somewhat discriminated against. In some cases, they can't, stand for election to various municipal posts and all that sort of stuff. But they are allowed to live there. They're allowed to trade, and again, this is kind of a natural buy-in for them because remember, a lot of our Jews in the late Middle Ages are involved in banking and money lending and trade. So being near the center of that in Amsterdam just makes sense. And of course, remember that a lot of our Jews have been kicked out of the Spanish territories either by Ferdinand and Isabella or by the subsequent Catholic monarchs who are really using the Inquisition to sort of push for religious Catholic orthodoxy. Now, of course, there is also a Catholic population in the Netherlands. The main Dutch church that is Calvinist. So sometimes our Catholics do tend to get discriminated against somewhat. But again, as long as they sort of contribute to society, as long as they don't cause any trouble, they're sort of allowed to do their thing. Due to trade, our Dutch diets are also really highly varied. They're eating a lot of meat, they're eating a lot of cheese, they're eating a lot of fish, they're importing grain, they're doing all this kinds of stuff. And so, as a result, people are healthy, and prosperity is going to reach relatively far down the social ladder, right? This is not necessarily a wealth that is reserved for only the super rich. many of our poorer artisans and so forth are actually attaining a higher standard of living as a result of expanding Dutch commerce and all that kind of stuff. And in fact, the government is even providing some housing and other sort of services for refugees from other countries, for widows, for the urban poor, and so forth and so on. And some of that actually continues today. In fact, last year, the government in I think it was Amsterdam, passed a rule that agreed to pay the homeless to clean up trash by giving them beer and sandwiches. So this is a if you want to buy into it, it's sort of it's a long term sort of Dutch policy. Let's get the poor involved, all that sort of stuff. The other thing that's interesting about the Netherlands, in addition to this religious freedom, is that there's a relatively free press as well. In fact, the first published English and French newspapers are not published in England or France. They're published in Amsterdam, where these merchants are operating, right? Also, that's allowing a lot of the knowledge from the scientific revolution to spread into other parts of Europe, into England and France in particular. When we talk about the scientific revolution, we'll definitely hit that. This is also, again, let's make another comparison to Renaissance Italy, very vibrant time for the art scene. We have a lot of Dutch and Flemish painting going on during this period, and some of it is really, really good stuff. It's almost all part of a period in European art that is called the Baroque. And so as a result, I'm not going to really beat that to death here because we're going to talk about that as sort of a separate entity. But I do want us to make note of the fact that as a result of the wealth and the patronage of the middle class, the bankers, the merchants, and in some cases the noblemen as well, we are going to see a lot of art produced. This is certainly an example of that. We are going to have this Baroque style be driven by a couple of things. First of all, again, not necessarily a fantastic example here, but we are going to see a lot of chiaroscuro. In fact, if we go back up, this is almost an example. We also have, in a lot of our Baroque art, a lot of really sort of dark, indistinct backgrounds, right? Also, we're going to have a lot more sort of common scenes. Instead of painting, as we saw in the Renaissance, instead of painting, kings and dukes and ambassadors, or alternatively in the Italian Renaissance, painting Christ and the saints and Last Suppers and Pietas and Madonnas, we're going to have a lot more images of just sort of people living their lives and doing their jobs. Again, here, these are, a bunch of people just celebrating a treaty. And they're not all wealthy. A lot of these are just members of sort of the municipal watch in Amsterdam, right? So they would have been maybe sort of a few professional soldiers, but mostly just sort of business people. Also, a lot more still lifes as well. Landscapes. We're beginning to see some, bowls of fruit and that kind of thing. And in particular, if we're talking about artists, like let's say hypothetically, a question about the connection between artistic work and sort of wealth and sponsorship came up, we would definitely want to mention Rembrandt. This is actually one of his pieces. It's called The Syndics of the Cloth Guild, right? So there's a bunch of members of a guild that are meeting together. We also have a gentleman named Vermeer who's going to do things like the geography, the astronomer, the girl with the pearl earring, and so forth and so on. And again, we're going to deal with all that in a separate lecture, so I don't want to beat it to death. So, the decline of the Dutch, right? So things go really well while they're fighting the 80 Years' War, and then after that for about another 50 years. By the time we get to the late 16 and into the 1700s, things are starting to fall apart for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're increasingly coming into conflict with the English as the English are beginning to colonize more and expand and sort of turn into the great naval power that they're going to become in the 17 and 1800s. They are competing with the Dutch because the Dutch have now won control of a lot of those trade routes from the Spanish, right? And there's sort of always a bigger fish. And so as the English state kind of gets its act together, they're going to have a little bit more muscle than the Dutch will because they're just bigger, they've got a bigger population, more natural resources, so forth and so on. The English, for example, as I already mentioned, are going to capture New Amsterdam and rename it New York. The English are also going to pass a series of navigation acts under Oliver Cromwell in the mid-1600s that are going to restrict Dutch access to English ports. And again, as the English are expanding, as they're controlling more overseas territory, it makes it harder and harder for the Dutch to find places to sell their goods. They're being displaced by the English. Meanwhile, the Dutch are also going to war with France, or rather, I should say, France is going to war with the Dutch. Now, remember, the French have been supporters of Dutch independence from Spain. But once the Dutch are independent, the French start going, if we can go in there and conquer these guys, we can really get our hands on a ton of money and new resources and new access to trade routes and all that sort of stuff. And so under Louis XIV, the Sun King, right, we are going to be invading the Netherlands, trying to take control of these various, cities and so forth and so on. In fact, this here is a painting in which we see King Louis sort of managing the siege of the city of Maastricht, which we're going to come back to again in the 1990s with the formation of the European Union. And of course, once again, the Princes of Orange are on the front line trying to defend the Republic. In fact, William of Orange, this is another William of Orange, who later is going to be William III of England, at one point opens all of the dikes to flood all of these lowlands and sort of trap the French army and force them to retreat. Right now, even though the Dutch are going to retain their independence, the conflict with both England and France, like the two sort of big power players on either side, is ultimately going to sort of bleed the Dutch dry. Their economic rivals are going to grow stronger. They're going to start running out of money, and then French culture is going to come to sort of dominate Dutch thinking and all that sort of stuff. So eventually, even though the Dutch are sort of the little country that could, eventually they become the little country that just couldn't anymore. And so we want to sort of keep that in mind as we're watching France and Great Britain, as England is about to become when it connects itself with Scotland and Wales and so forth. We're going to watch those two become the great powers of the 18th century as the Dutch start to sort of slide into obscurity. So that's about all that I've got. So this is sort of one of our shorter ones, and we'll be back at a later time. Thanks for sticking with me.